Okay, so we're going to talk about integrated change models and how they're used to understand organizations better when it comes to implementing change programs. Um, these are typically used on large-scale change transformation programs, and there are many ways to, many theorists that have done a lot of research over the last 50 so odd years, and I want to share some of the highlights of that research. Okay. So what are integrated models? Well, generally speaking, a model and a framework, we use that word interchangeably. In my last unit, we talked about frameworks. Frameworks are more theoretical. They're more sort of premise-based. Integrated models are actually using those theory and maybe creating blueprints, or they allow us to create organizational blueprints. Very often they're graphically depicted. They show the relationship between content and process. We talked about content and process in the last module. And they help shift thinking from what the organizational change is and the imperatives for change to about how we're going to actually implement the change, right? So it's more answering the how question and not the why question. The theory models start to help us understand why we're implementing change. So that's a general characteristics, okay? Well, again, what is a model? It's a representation. It's a picture. It is often metaphorical, and it has often references to inputs and outputs from the model. So it's very system-based in terms of its theory. Models can help categorize and understand data better. They break down problems into smaller chunks. Engineers love that, right? We all love, if we're from an engineering background, we love breaking down a larger problem into many smaller ones that are more manageable. And these organizational models help us do that in different ways. And they're different ones that are used for different purposes. The models also help us understand where to focus our energy, where to focus the action-oriented work that needs to be done, and who's going to do that work. They allow for interpretation and dissemination of information. They provide a common language to deal with and to work with and to talk to our staff and our management. They guide our actions for change, okay? So that's largely how we think about models. There are two caveats, two important caveats I want to point out at this point, right? One is a model is only as good as how we define each of those subcomponents, right? So if we break down those products, the model into smaller bite-sized increments, we've got to make sure that there's nothing lost in that translation. Otherwise, we would be solving the wrong problem. We also have inherent ways that the model can actually limit us. If the model is not easy to understand and easy to explain, then we will have a problem because it starts to limit what we can do with it in the organization. How we implement the change starts to become a choke point. So we have to be careful that we define the model and keep it simple, keep it accurate as we're working up and down the chain of the model, and that there's nothing lost in the translation, and that we're not overcomplicating it or overboiling the ocean because it may start to limit us. Now, these are two big caveats. This is where companies, because of lack of experience in implementing large-scale change, many times they struggle with these two. That's why I want to point this out. Many of the models that we're talking about today, that we're reviewing, are based on Levitt's work in 1965. Levitt had a model that focused mostly on descriptive behavior, right? Focused on interaction, interdependence of tasks as it related to people, process, technology, structure, those types of common elements, right? So if we look at the original model, the 4 quadrants, right? And connecting the structure, the technology, tasks, and the people together. That's what Levitt's system model focused on. Weisbord in '76 created a 6-box organizational model. Okay? He based it on like a controller's radar screen, like almost like an air traffic controller's radar screen, right? The 6 blips that we're about to see are like what you would expect on a battleship's or a submarine's radar screen, or a airline pilot's radar depiction of the skies. And it starts to show where the important and trouble areas are, right? Sort of a early warning sign or early warning indicator, much like a radar. So you've got interrelationships in Weisbord's model between the purpose, the structure, the rewards that are in place, mechanism to facilitate, and the relationships between people and understanding those to manage conflict better. And leadership obviously is needed at the core because we need to make sure that all of these different boxes are balanced, right? And also in congruence with the environment. The Tushman congruence model, also sometimes known as Nadler-Tushman's congruence model, is based on an open system organism behavior, right, or metaphor. We talked about how biology and open systems and open cell structures are inherent to understanding organizational change. We've been talking about that all semester. But this model goes further, right, than that. It talks about recognizing that units or sub-organizations, or even the larger organizations, are dynamic and they must fit together. Otherwise, you cannot achieve the transformation because you'll be leaving certain organizational elements out of the picture. So the connectivity between the cells of the organization is paramount. That's what Nadler and Tushman established. And it's widely accepted, of course. Here's a picture of it, right? You've got tasks, you've got the individuals assigned to the task, you've got some sort of informal organization that governs, some governance processes. You have, the inputs to this transformational process, and then the outputs. You have outputs of the form organizational, group, and individual. So there's impact to organizational groups and individuals that are related, but also could be distinct, right? And then you have a feedback loop. They recommend a 3-step process. Identify the system that you're going to have in place to manage this transformation. Determine the nature of the key variables. What are the moving parts? What should we know about the moving parts? And then perform a holistic diagnostic analysis, right? To make sure that the systems will fit for purpose, will be fit for purpose, rather. Ticci's model, and pay attention to this because we're going to have a case study on this. Ticci's TPC, we call it TPC, Technical Political Cultural Framework, builds on Nadler-Tushman's work, right? It came several years later, 1983. But the difference here is it focuses on the change, and it describes and breaks down the change into 9 different levers, right? Managing is not shown because Ticci assumes that you have to manage the whole change process. He doesn't focus on the management. He realized that leadership is important. It's a necessary inhabitant, right? So he doesn't talk a lot about it. He doesn't show it in the model. It's an implied aspect of large-scale change transformation. Here's his framework. Starts with the input, right? Information about the history, the environment. What resources do you have at your bear? What resources don't you have at your bear? What resources you wish you had at your bear? Developing a mission strategy, right? Developing the blueprint of why, what, how, explaining everything to everybody, making sure everybody is in congruence. Then developing tasks. This is very, it lends itself to a project management approach, as you can see, right? You've heard me talk a lot about my project management in my project management class. But we break down strategic guidelines, strategic framework for an organization to operational framework, which are the tasks. You assign people to those tasks. Because those people start working on those tasks, they inherently develop networks that then connect. From that, processes emerge, right? You can even think of this very nicely from a startup. A startup doesn't start necessarily with a lot of complicated processes or intricate processes. They start with innovation many times. They start with work directives. They start with investor focus areas. And then from there, they start to morph as they get bigger, as they establish quick wins. They start to develop networks within their organization, internal and external, with partners, and they start to develop organizational processes over time. And finally, if they do all of this well, there's a positive impact. Could have a negative impact. It's unfortunately happens a lot, but the goal is to have that positive impact, get people functioning correctly, and start to create output. And then you'll have a feedback loop that focuses right back or flushes that information, distills that information back into the input loop, and the framework continues. Ticci's framework are also dealing with three different aspects: technical and political and cultural. These are the three primary systems that cut across the 9 levers. They require alignment between the systems and the levers for effective change to occur. So he recognizes that you don't necessarily need only these 9 areas, but you also have technical, political, and geocultural impacts. And therefore, he creates this famous matrix, right? This is the matrix that take all of the organizational components, then they take the core systems, the technical, political, and cultural, and starts to provide a rating. So you can see, you can almost complete this for a particular chain, amount of within system alignment, you score it, and then you score amount required on the bottom for each organizational change component, and you have a total alignment score that spans between 0 and 36. There are limitations to this model, right? The people component is barely mentioned. It's very small, but we all know that in change, people is the people aspect sometimes and most often plays a large role in the success of the change, right? But Ticci sort of doesn't give it as much importance. So in some ways, you can say that Ticci provides even or gives a lower priority to individuals and people aspects of change than even group and organizational levels, right? However, it's got a few good strengths. The model includes most of the variables that are critical to understanding and changing organizations, right? It's pretty comprehensive. If you look at this framework, it's a pretty comprehensive, it's a nice grid that you score, and you can start to see where you stand in terms of change readiness and change. If we look at all these models, you'll see that they all feel a little different, but basically, if you, at the core, they're more alike than unlike. They're also all based on this famous open system theory that we've been talking about, dynamic, biological in some sense, right? Implying human, right? Differences in how they address output is a key differentiator for each of these models, right? They do all account for structure and people, just at varying levels. And they also do all account for mission, purpose, and strategy, which we have learned by now is very, very important at the onset of a change, right? Having a purpose, a mission, a strategy for how to implement the change, why we're doing this is extremely paramount. No model is going to come in the way of that. And none of the three that we've discussed today actually violate that, they build on it. Wiseboard is the only one that we talked about, if we look at it from a comparison standpoint, who makes leadership and rewards explicit. Culture is used differently, but is still used by all of the models. Wiseboard's model emphasizes leadership, while Nadler-Tishman emphasized congruence and connectivity. And Tichy emphasizes, all that's good, but let's align. Let's make sure that everybody's in harmony, in sync. Wiseboard and Nadler-Tishman models are more contingency model, while Nietzsche's is more normative, right? It is talking about and addressing how things are and how do we make things work in the way things are. It's not as radical, so to speak. It's more confirming and conformatory than it is radical. Okay, so that's a little bit about models and how you can think about implementing change in organizations. I think these are good to be able to do some case studies on as a next step. I'm going to pause here and before we continue to the next unit.